Hello. Well, it's a beautiful sunny day today, and ordinarily at this time of year we'd be out on site at the Ness of Brodgar excavating, but obviously given the circumstances we're not, so I'm talking to you today from indoors, just down the road from the Ness. And what I want to talk about today are a number of rocks from the site. Now, one of the things that makes the site so remarkable is the extraordinary scale and condition of the buildings that litter the isthmus, of which there are many. And it's very unusual to see buildings in 3 dimensions with that level of survival. And understandably, those buildings have attracted a huge amount of attention and a huge amount of imagination over the last 10, 12 years we've been digging. But there are also lots of really interesting angles to explore by looking at the smaller things that are often overlooked, often forgotten, and probably overlooked and forgotten by people 5,000 years ago on the site. So what I want to do today is to talk about a number of objects, relatively small, relatively simple, and talk about how the nature of those objects, and in particular their raw materials, open up a story about the Ness of Brodgar and its place not just on the isthmus and not just on mainland, but also in the archipelago as a whole, and even in much wider worlds that take in the Irish Sea, mainland Britain, and even further afield. So the idea will be to take a sequence of objects, one at a time, and talk about how the character of the object, the stone that it's made from, how it's been worked, can give us insights into those broader worlds that people in the Neolithic, like now, were always a part of, and try and explore how those different aspects of the objects tell us things that ordinarily we might overlook. Okay, let's start with something close to home. This is a small cobble, and it's been worked as a hammerstone. And if you look close, which is the watchword of the best kinds of science, you will notice that it's been heavily pecked. It has crushing and hammering scars over the end here, which just flattens it off, and there are more around here. This was a small cobble hammerstone that rested in someone's hand, right or left, and they would have used it to work other kinds of rock, in particular flint, which I'll talk about in a little while. There's something about these hammerstones which I just find really, really magnetic, because when you hold one and you feel that weight, that heft in your hand, and you see the marks, so you know how it was held and you know how it was used, there's a kind of immediacy to people working with materials that I get from something like this, which sometimes the more elegant and the more museum-friendly objects don't really give you. But what's interesting about this rock is that it's just a piece of the local sandstone, very dense, therefore good to use as a hammer. But it's that shape, it's that rounded quality to it. Now that rounded quality has been worked onto the stone and into the stone, but not by people. The hammer marks are the result of people working. The rounded surface is all a consequence of rolling back and forth in the middle of the sea, as George Mackay Brown would have put it. This is a cobble from a beach. Now what's interesting about this particular rock, like many rocks that make up the fabric of the material we're digging at the Ness, is that you wouldn't find a rock like this on the shores of the Loch of Stennis or the Loch of Harry, because what you need to make one of these, if you're the sea, is lots of energy and lots of time. So you get something like this from a rock being pulled back and forth in the middle of the ocean on a beach that has a lot more energy to it. In other words, a beach that's exposed to big tidal rises and falls, storms and so on. And that's the kind of grinding process that creates these sorts of cobbles and makes effectively tools that are good to go and good to use. So when we find something like this at the Ness, and we find them in great numbers, this tells us immediately that the people who lived or who gathered there at different times over 5,000 years ago brought material from other places. It might have been a relatively local shore, it might have been over towards Stromness, It might have been down out of the Bay of Ireland and round the corner towards Scapa Flow. It could even have been from the west coast, the Atlantic coast, over towards Scale Bay and Skara Brae. So even though it's a very simple object, it has been brought into the site from somewhere else. So immediately it connects us to another place. And the same goes for this object as well. This isn't a hammerstone. This is what we call in the business a polissoir, which is a rather lovely word, which simply refers to the fact that it's been used for grinding and polishing different materials. And frequently these are used for the final, really fine polishing of really elegant axes and mace heads and things like that. What's interesting about this loaf of bread, shaped, sure, in the current climate, with everyone making sourdough bread at home, we've all been producing things like this in our ovens, if we're lucky. What's beautiful about this is, first of all, the surface there is like wet glass. It's incredibly smooth from hours and hours of patient grinding back and forth, almost glacially. But it's made on a cobble of quartzite, a very dense, very tough, very heavy cobble. And for this to have been shaped to the extent that it has, again by the sea, we must be dealing with a lot of energy, which you're going to find on a big storm beach, somewhere like Scale Bay, or indeed further afield on the west coast. So the presence of something like this, which has clearly been important to people, that they've looked after it, that they've carefully kept it and used it over and over again, and then sometimes deliberately buried or deposited them with some formality. This has been brought in at least from 5 to 10 kilometres away. So again, it's one of these examples of an object which has a certain basic practical use and is what we would call local stone. But at that immediate human scale, this polissoir, like the Hammerstone, connects the people of the Ness to a broader hinterland, to an environment that stretches all the way across to the west coast and perhaps further afield on mainland. Okay, here's another group of objects found from the Ness during excavations over the last few years, which speak very nicely to this idea of the broader settings of the site, as well as the nature of the communities that were resident there or gathered there. And this is a piece of flint. It's a very silica-rich rock. I've got 2 or 3 pieces here, and it's a rock that was favoured in prehistory, but certainly in the Neolithic in Orkney, for making a variety of different kinds of tools. Simple knives, like this, which is a fairly nice, well, for Orkney, quite a large blade, long flake of flint, trimmed along the edges and then trimmed quite steeply to form an edge which is particularly good and resilient for scraping. Fairly simple tools made from flint, and you'll have noticed that there are a number of different colours as well. Here again is a different kind of artefact. Again, flint. You hold this up to the light, it's almost translucent. You can see filaments running through it. Very fine, very glassy rock, very good for working. This is an arrowhead, of which we have a number at the Ness. Fairly typical late Neolithic form of arrowhead. What makes these objects really interesting is, to begin with, the nature of the rock from which they're made and where that rock has come from. If you talk to geologists, they will tell you that flint doesn't outcrop on Orkney. And it's true. Flint was not part of the basic Devonian geology which defines the region and gives the archipelago its form. Flint comes in during the Ice Age. During the last Ice Age, glacial movement down from what we would now call Norway and up along the coast of Scotland, the east coast of Scotland, brings in large quantities of material that's been scooped up from the bottom of what we call the North Sea. And that gets dumped as the ice retreats as clay, the boulder clays that cover a good deal of particularly the eastern side of the archipelago. And in those boulder clays, in the till, are nodules of flint. And they're this kind of thing. Everyone a Henry Moore. Very beautiful, patinated, and again rolled, very tough rock, but rolled by the sea and etched by light and water so that it gets this rather pale cortex on it. And inside these lumps, the meat of the flint is this much more glassy material which can be worked in a number of different ways. So there is flint here, but it was brought in by the ice. It's not here as part of the original geology. Now what's interesting about that is because of the pattern of ice movement during the last ice age, we know that the majority of the till and the majority of the flint that was dumped at that time tends to be greatest in the northern and eastern side of the archipelago. Yet here we are at the Ness of Brodgar in the West Mainland, and yet we have flint artefacts. And having walked many beaches with Hugo, a friend of mine, looking for flint, just naturally occurring on the beaches as a result of the till being washed out, we find that the density of flint over on this side of the archipelago is much, much lower. So the chances are that the flint artefacts, the cores for working stone, the artefacts like scrapers, knives and arrowheads are for the most part made on flint that has come in not from 5 kilometres away, but maybe as much as 25 or 30 kilometres away. And it's quite possible when we get very distinctive reddy brown, it's almost purple coloured flint like this, we tend to find this not on mainland but on other islands. It turns up in North Ronaldsay, it turns up in Papi, it turns up much further over to the east. So what's interesting about these objects is that in terms of their raw material, they're telling us again that whatever else they were connected to, the people of the Ness, like the people of Skara Brae, the people of Barnhouse not too far away, were caught up in networks of movement and probably trade and communication with other groups of people around the region. And it may be that it's through trade of one kind or another that flint is being moved around. It also may be that there are people coming into the Ness and Brodgar area, to that place where we have large ceremonial gathering sites, the stones of Stennis, Ring of Brodgar, and they bring flint or they bring tools with them. So there's a slightly broader geographic and social scale to life in the Neolithic in Orkney, which is hinted at by these objects. But even the simplest ones, and the arrowhead would be a fairly good example of that, even the simplest ones hint at something larger and something perhaps that's rather difficult for us to grasp with our view of prehistory as being essentially a very simple world and a simple time, which it wasn't. These kinds of arrowheads, very distinctive in their form and often very distinctive in terms of the way that the flint is worked to create the flake that you make the arrowhead out of. The way of working that lies behind making this little projectile point is shared by people who are living in the south of Britain. So you will find right across mainland Britain, during the late Neolithic, the time when the Ness is at its zenith, if you like, there are people making the same kind of choices to make the same kinds of arrowheads. And it's things like that that I think sometimes just really catch my imagination, is what kind of world gives you an opportunity to copy, to share a set of ideas about what a very simple arrowhead should look like. The fact that there are people many, many days of journey across water or across land, living in completely different parts of the country, and yet they share a common understanding of what certain kinds of objects should look like. Not only what they should look like as a finished form, but also how you should make that form. And that kind of connection speaks of a fluidity of movement, of ideas, of materials, and of people across much of mainland Britain, throughout the Irish Sea, which just runs counter to the way that we tend to draw boundaries now, which are fairly rigid and very clear and very singular. Life isn't like that. It's not like that now, and it almost certainly wasn't like that then. Now, so far I've been talking about objects which have almost certainly originated geologically or as a result of the movement of ice within the archipelago of Orkney. And that has told us, the presence of those objects at the Ness has told us that however the place was occupied 5,000 or more years ago, there were connections between that place and other parts of the region. A flow of people, a flow of objects, a flow of materials, and a flow of ideas back and forth. I think there's a tendency when we study prehistory, particularly when we're studying the traces of small farming communities, particularly the Neolithic communities of Orkney, that we assume that life is close-grained, really focused on the hearth and the home and the small group of people with whom you live. And the clustering of buildings at places like Skyax tend to sort of encourage that view. But I think what's interesting about much of the material that's turning up from the Ness, which would find parallels on many other sites as well, is that those people living that close-grained life, attentive to the seasons, with perhaps times of the year when they would be more extensive in their movement and other times of the year when they would be perhaps much more close and focused and huddling indoors away from the wind and the cold, that those people are always part of something bigger. And that bigger world is shifting and changing all the time. Now, an object like this takes us to those broader worlds rather more directly. It's a small axe. It has a finely polished cutting edge, which has got some damage on it, not recent damage from the Neolithic. And the moment you look at something like this, you can see that the person or people who were responsible for making it have chosen a piece of stone that once it is ground hastily backwards and forwards and then polished with fine sands and silt and water, they've chosen this piece of stone because the stone itself is incredibly striking. One of the things that archaeologists sometimes aren't as good at as perhaps they should be, particularly given the way they get very obsessive about their own tools, is recognizing that something that has a functional role, a practical use, can also be something that is shaped by aesthetics. And I think when you look at something like this axe, which was very carefully and very deliberately laid to rest as a kind of closing deposit in one of the buildings, structure 14 at the Ness of Brodgar, you're looking very obviously at an object which was important for what it looked like and what it felt like in the hand, and not just how easy it was or effective it was to use. So, to misquote Levi-Strauss, stone tools can be good to think with as well as good to use. So what makes this particular axe really interesting is the rock from which it's made. It's a rock called gneiss, and it's a very distinctive, wonderful swirls of green and cream. Definitely, I think, without any doubt, the people who were responsible for making this object chose it because it is so striking. This is something that you would remember. This is something that you would recognize. With some of these objects, it's quite possible that they may even have had names. But what makes this very interesting is that the rock itself is not from Orkney. The rock comes from the Western Isles, and it's known as Lewisian gneiss. Now, we don't know as yet, because we have several other pieces of this on the site, whether or not the raw material, the rock, comes in from the Western Isles and is then fashioned into objects, or whether the finished objects themselves were brought in from along the coast and down into the Western Isles. It could be both. What matters for our purposes today is that the presence of this rock tells us that there were lines of communication that extended out beyond the archipelago of Orkney and around the coast and down to the Western Isles. And again, I think this is really interesting because, for a number of reasons, but one of them is that when we think about the Neolithic and we think about farming, we tend to think about land-based forms of living. And yet, the presence of an object like this tells us that it was still, in the Neolithic, a maritime world. It was still possible to move beyond the archipelago, to travel across the Pentland Firth, to move around the coast, to drop down into the Irish Sea, to travel to the Western Isles, to meet people that you might have been connected to through allegiances or affiliation, people you might have been related to, people you might share a line of descent with. Again, that sense of a wider world. This is not the only object that we have made of this particular rock. We have fragments of a number of mace heads from the site and also from the Ness of Brodgar area. And so far, field walking and excavation has shown that objects from the Western Isles, amongst other places, tend to be concentrated in that sort of broad Ness of Brodgar area. And again, that's kind of interesting given that this is the place where we find the biggest monuments, which are likely to be a focus for gatherings of all sorts of different kinds. Maybe those gatherings involve people not just coming in from the outer isles of Orkney itself, but also from further afield, and certainly from the coast of mainland Scotland and from the Western Isles. And it's a really beautiful thing. The thing obviously about a really beautiful axe that I was just showing you, an axe which has got to be known on site colloquially as the Skyax because it looks like it's got clouds in it. It's very easy to say something and persuade people that it's a really important and interesting object because it is so striking, because that sense of an aesthetic in its making and in its finishing is very evident. But, and this is a challenge for you, I find something like this as exciting as the axe in some ways. And there are several reasons for this, which I'd like to try and explain. What is it? Well, it's a fairly dull looking piece of stone. It's a volcanic stone, and it shares with materials like flint what we call the property of conchoidal fracture. And what that means is when you have a lump of it and you hit it, it tends to break in a fairly regular and controlled manner so that you get a large sort of bulb just below where it's been struck, and then a flake will come off. And if you look at this piece, you can see that it's got a series of scars, like ripples, that run across the surface, in this case in that direction. And these are the scars that have been left behind by taking other flakes off a larger block. Now, the Ness of Brodgar, with its extraordinary architecture, is covered with bits of stone that are a result of people dressing and shaping blocks to build the walls of the remarkable structures there. So there are thousands of those all over the place. So you have to admire an archaeologist, it wasn't me, who spotted amongst all of that material this particular flake, because it actually looks fairly similar to many of the sort of little bits of material knocked off during dressing stone for walling. So they picked it up and it was bagged. And I remember actually when it was found, I was off site. I was picking someone up at the airport, I think, and I got a text message from Nick saying, "Get to site quick." And he didn't tell me what it was. So I got there and then had this plonked in my hand. Why I get quite excited about this in a rather childish manner is it's the nature of the rock. Because this rock is a volcanic ash called tuff. Technically, I think you would say an epidotised tuff. And the reason why that's interesting to me is that it's a rock that outcrops in the Borrowdale volcanics in the central fells of Cumbria. And there's an outcrop that runs for about 18 kilometres, meandering its way around the fells, but particularly around the Langdale Pikes in the centre of Cumbria. And on the tops of the pikes are a series of quarries. And those quarries, which are about 5,000 or more years old, were quarries that were used to work stone, to work this volcanic rock into axes, into stone axes. And there's a kind of biographical connection as well, because I spent a good many years, and I still go up there from time to time, working on those quarries. So that I have a particular affection for them, I guess. And I just find stoneworking fascinating anyway. So it's a volcanic ash spewed out of a volcano and settling in a relatively shallow sea, which is then compressed, pressure and time, making this very dense rock. And here it is, a flake knocked off of a larger lump of this volcanic tuff, probably at a quarry in what we would now call, post-Wordsworth, the Lake District. And here it is in Orkney, turning up at the Ness of Brodgar. It hasn't been reworked, it hasn't been shaped into anything, but it is nonetheless a piece of a place, a piece of rock that's come all the way from the central fells of Cumbria, perhaps by boat, along with people and other things, maybe some animals coming up the west coast of England and then Scotland and around to Orkney. But again, it's one of these pieces of rock that connects people here to people in other parts of the country. Now, what I find really interesting is that it's just the raw material. There are about 6 small stone axe heads that have been found in Orkney, which are made of the same rock, which have almost certainly come from the central fells of Cumbria. I couldn't tell you which quarry because there are many scattered throughout the central fells. One of the things that's interesting, though, is that it is just the rock. And what perhaps that tells us is that this isn't just a rock that's moved from A to B over some considerable distance. It's a rock that's made that journey because the place it comes from is important, because the place and the rock outcrop that it comes from is something that people know about. They've heard about in stories when they're sat around by their fires or when they're meeting with people from other places. It's possible in that perhaps rather more fluid world than we sometimes imagine that they may have travelled into different parts of what we would call mainland Britain. But it's unlikely, I think, that lots of people in Orkney would have been going up to the mountains. So the chances are that very few of them knew exactly where the source was, but they may have heard about the source, they may have heard about the stone, and they may have heard about the kind of things that were made there. Things like this. This is one of the stone axes that is made from the same rock, and you see the difference in colour. The reason for that is that this has been polished back and forth. You can still see some of the flake scars poking through the ground and polished surface. If you tilt it in the light, you can see long rail marks where somebody has basically pushed it backwards and forwards on a grinding slab to make one of these. These again are tools which are also good to think with. Objects to be displayed, objects to be carried, used in various tasks, perhaps even sometimes used as weapons. But above all else, used in exchange. Giving gifts from one family, from one person to another, from one community to another, is something that probably would have been very important in kind of gluing together the broader social world. Giving gifts to maintain obligations, to pay debts. It was through the circulation from hand to hand of things like this that those wider connections between communities were made in Neolithic Britain. And we know this because several thousand of these have been found across the country, and sometimes 500 or 600 kilometres away from their source. So these were objects that often served very practical purposes, but they were nonetheless really good vehicles for carrying people and connections between people. Because if you were given this in an important exchange, perhaps during a gathering at the Stones of Ness or the Ring of Brodgar, it's a very striking and distinctive object, but it would be an object that also carried with it the biography of the person that had given it to you, and perhaps a sense of obligation that you owed something to that person, allegiance, affiliation, whatever it might be. Now this one wasn't found in Orkney, and when we find axes of Cumbrian stone in Orkney, they tend to be much smaller, and they're often very distinctively Orcadian in their form because there was, if you like, a regional way of doing things. But the chances are that what gave this rock its value to people, what made it catch their imaginations, was its association with a source lying near the top of a mountain from which these kinds of things could be made. Now this has a rather more oblique and perhaps more poetic connection to the previous axe that I showed you, which was from the Western Isles. Because on site we've tended to call that beautiful green and cream marbled axe the Skyax because it looks like it's made of clouds. What I found very interesting about the quarries in the Lake District is a quality that they share with some of the most spectacular quarries that exist anywhere in continental Europe, where a certain kind of jadeite was being worked to produce really just crazily beautiful axes in the Neolithic, is that the quarries and the outcrops are so high up the mountains that they are almost always in clouds. And so you begin to wonder whether or not that the drama of some of these sources, of climbing to them, of disappearing into the clouds, of getting hold of the rock and then bringing it back down again, was something that people recognised at the time. And perhaps that might have been a thread that was woven into the tapestry of stories about them when people talked about them in a place like the Ness of Brodgar. Okay, so what I've tried to do over the last 20-25 minutes or so is take a number of objects, some of them immediately striking, others perhaps seemingly rather mundane, and explore how an awareness of the rock from which they're made, their petrology, how that relates to the geology of Orkney and of further afield, allows us to explore that broader world within which the people of the Ness were set. It doesn't tell us exactly what kind of connections existed between people at the Ness and folk in Skara Brae or in East Mainland or further afield in the archipelago. And it doesn't necessarily tell us exactly how people in Orkney were connected to people in other parts of Britain and Ireland and indeed further beyond. But it does tell us that those connections existed. It tells us that boundaries were shifting from one season and from one year to another, that worlds overlapped in a way that, again, perhaps many contemporary politicians would rather they didn't. And I think that's what makes work on these smaller objects so exciting, is that whatever they may tell us about the kind of activities that people undertook, whatever they can tell us about the levels of skill that people invested in making some of these things, because that stands out with the buildings at the Ness, that many of them have levels of architectural accomplishment, skills in masonry, which are almost unparalleled, certainly in Orkney, that we can see similar kinds of things with some of the small objects as well. But in the end, when we're trying to make sense of how people 5,000 years ago made sense of these objects themselves, these pieces of different places, we come back to the centrality of the imagination. For all that we look close and use a variety of different scientific techniques to analyse the material that we recover from the excavations, as all archaeologists do, there is still a space that's left for our imaginations, and a space that I think is absolutely central to the scientific process. I mean, if anything really emerged with the Age of Wonder, when science began to coalesce around a number of different areas of interest, it is that combination of looking close, of creating really tight descriptions of things, of asking lots of questions of material, but at the same time using one's imagination. And it's for that reason, as much as anything else, that I thought I would finish by talking about this object. This was an extraordinary day. It's that capacity that things have to hold memories, to hold people, to hold ideas. When I see this and when I pick it up, and I know that's a real privilege to be able to do that, I think about the day it was found. I think about the day when, I think it was Molly, called across the trench to me and said, "Is this anything?" And I looked round and I saw, just poking out of the ground, the side of this. It's what we call a carved stone ball, and it's one of a tiny number which has been found in an archaeological context. In other words, found during an excavation as opposed to in a ploughed field or dropping out of a dune on an eroding beach cliff. It's made of camptonite, which is derived from one of the relatively local lamprophytic dikes that occur in some profusion. I think they're now generally known as the Orkney Swarm across West Mainland, but you find camptonite and other kinds of dikes in other parts of the region too. So the rock is relatively local. It was buried in the foundations of one of the buttresses inside Structure 10, one of the most elaborate and one of the most impressive buildings, possibly one of the most impressive buildings standing anywhere in Neolithic Britain when it was constructed. And this was built into the foundation of one of the internal buttresses. What I find really interesting about this object is, first of all, that sense of connectedness, because we find carved stone balls and they are quite varied in their character, right across northeast Scotland where there's quite a large number. There's a number in Orkney. You also find a few in the Western Isles, but they are very much a sort of broadly a Scottish phenomenon. We don't know what most of them are made of, but in this particular case we do. It's made of this local stone camptonite. And it's got these carved bosses. You can see them as I turn it in my hand. What this object tells me is that people at the Ness, the people who are responsible for making this, the people who are responsible for putting it into the ground, and it may well be that there was some huge interval of time, it might be several generations after it was made, that it was buried, again, I think quite deliberately, in the foundations of Structure 10. The people who made this were making something in accordance with ideas about the form of an object, which was shared with other communities right across the northern part of mainland Scotland and through into the Irish Sea Zone. So again, it's made of local stone, but it conforms to a set of common ideas. That in itself speaks to the main aim of today's discussion, which is about connections, different scales of contact, communication, ebbing and flowing back and forth within Orkney and between Orkney and other parts of the world, the known world then. But then the other reason for finishing with this is because when it comes to working out what it's for, when it comes to working out what it may have meant to people, the basic truth is we haven't a single idea. Well, we've got hundreds of ideas actually, but we don't know. Over the last 100 years or so, there have been a huge amount of speculation as to the significance of these things. You will hear people talking about their role as weights, as net sinkers. People sometimes talk about them as the weights that you might find attached to a bowlass, to some kind of throwing line which would be used to bring down animals. Other people talk about them as toys. Other people talk about them as the realization of the Platonic solids. And still more have talked about the possibility that they're some kind of sacred object. The moment they start to talk in those terms, things start to become very abstract. But we're talking here about what we might recognize as rosary beads, worry beads, what various Aboriginal groups in Australia would call chiringas, sacred objects, where what's important is the handling of them. And one of the things that I've always found quite striking about these carved stone balls is that, for the most part, they're all very similar in size. I suspect that that's not because people were obsessed with weights and measurements in the way that perhaps sometimes we might be. What matters is that it fits in the hand. What matters is that it's almost impossible to put this in your hand without wanting to turn it. And turning it and tracing your finger or thumb around the contours of this thing is like going on a journey. Now, whether that's a journey into memory, whether it's a journey into a particular way of thinking, or whether it's simply an aid to contemplation, I don't know. Nobody does. But again, one of the things that I've always found frustrating about objects like this is that whilst we can tell certain parts of their story from the rock they're made from, and from the way in which they've been worked and the way in which they've been shaped, sometimes an insight into the significance of an object really comes into focus when you pick it up and you hold it. And that's one of the things that makes my life a real joy, is that I get the pleasure of being able to do that. Once this is on display in a museum, wherever that might be, you don't get to hold it. So I'm very lucky. Thank you very much.